The transport shuttle's descent through Xylos 7 atmosphere felt like falling through a bruise. The sky outside the viewport churned in shades of violet and sickly green, clouds thick with ammonia, and something else, something that made the metal hull groan like a wounded animal. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, watching the surface rise to meet us. Below, the jungle sprawled in impossible colors, trees with black bark and leaves that pulsed with bioluminescence, rivers that ran silver instead of blue, and somewhere down there in that beautiful nightmare of a world, the Coalition had lost contact with their forward research station 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of silence. 3 weeks of nothing, but automated distress signals repeating on an endless loop. First-time off-world recruit. The voice came from behind me, gravelly and amused. I turned to find Sergeant Vex watching me from across the cabin, his 4 arms folded across his chest in that way that told me he'd already sized me up and found me wanting. "First time on a death world, sir," I replied, keeping my voice steady. Something flickered in his amber eyes. Respect, maybe, or just surprise that the human hadn't wet himself yet. The other recruits in the cabin, 8 of them, all Coalition species from different star systems, snickered behind their hands. I'd heard the whispers when I'd boarded. Another human. Why do they keep sending them? They're barely space-worthy, soft, fragile, good for nothing but manual labor and making coffee. That last one had come from a Veldan named Cathar, all 4 of his eyes blinking in sequence as he'd looked me up and down. I'd met his gaze and held it until he'd looked away. Humans had a reputation in the Coalition. It wasn't a good one. "We're 30 seconds from touchdown," the pilot announced over the intercom. "Weather conditions are—" There was a pause, static crackling. "Weather conditions are what we expected. Hostile. Everyone stay sharp." The shuttle lurched as we hit a pocket of turbulence, and I grabbed the overhead rail to keep from stumbling. Around me, the other recruits adjusted their stance with practiced ease. They'd been training for years. I'd been training for 6 months. 6 months since the Coalition had extended their desperate offer to Earth. 6 months since they'd started recruiting from the backward systems, looking for bodies to throw at problems they couldn't solve with their advanced technology and superior alien biology. 6 months since I'd volunteered. The shuttle touched down with a jarring thud that rattled my teeth. Hydraulics hissed as the landing gear engaged, and then the ramp began to lower, letting in a rush of air that smelled like rotten eggs and flowers. "Move out," Sergeant Vex barked. "Formation Bravo, weapons hot." I fell into line behind the others, my pulse thrumming in my ears. The standard-issue Coalition rifle felt alien in my hands, too light, too sleek, with a firing mechanism I still didn't fully trust. Back on Earth, I'd trained with old-style kinetics. These energy weapons were something else entirely. The ramp hit the ground, and we stepped out into Xylos 7. The heat hit me first. Not the dry heat of a desert or the wet heat of a jungle back home. This was something different. Something that pressed against my skin from all directions, making my lungs work harder with each breath. The air was thick with moisture and the cloying sweetness of the bioluminescent plants that surrounded the landing pad. The research station stood at the center of a clearing, its prefab walls streaked with something dark and organic. The Coalition flag had been torn down, replaced by nothing, just bare metal where it had been. "Looks like they left in a hurry," Cathar muttered, all 4 of his eyes scanning the perimeter. "Or they never left at all," I said. The Veldan shot me a look that could have curdled milk, but he didn't respond. Sergeant Vex was already moving toward the station's main entrance, his plasma rifle raised, and his secondary arms drawing a sidearm from his hip. The rest of us followed in a loose formation, our footsteps echoing oddly in the thick air. The door was ajar. Inside, the station was a mess. Chairs overturned, consoles flickering with error messages, and the walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges that had been carved by something with claws the size of my forearm. "Contact," someone whispered. "Movement, northwest quadrant." We all froze, weapons trained on the corridor that led deeper into the station. And then we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It vibrated through the floor, through the walls, through my bones. It was the sound of something ancient and patient and hungry. "Everyone back to the shuttle," Sergeant Vex said, his voice barely above a whisper. Now slow and quiet. We started moving backward, keeping our weapons trained on the corridor. The growl grew louder, and I could hear something else underneath it now. The clicking of claws on metal, the wet sound of breathing. And then it emerged from the shadows. I'd seen pictures of apex predators from a dozen different worlds. Nothing had prepared me for this. It was massive, easily the size of a small building, with a carapace that shimmered like oil on water. 6 legs, each ending in claws that could rend steel. A head that seemed to be made of nothing but teeth and eyes, dozens of them, all focused on us with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. A Xylosian Ravager. The Coalition had told us they were extinct, that the last one had been killed 50 years ago by a team of elite soldiers who'd sacrificed themselves to take it down. Clearly, that report had been wrong. "Don't move," Sergeant Vex said. "Don't move, don't breathe, don't." The Ravager lunged. It happened so fast that I barely registered the motion. One moment it was at the end of the corridor, its eyes gleaming with predatory hunger. The next, it was among us, claws slashing, teeth snapping. Cathar screamed as one of those claws caught him across the chest, tearing through his Coalition-issue armor like wet paper. The other recruits scattered, firing wildly as they tried to find cover. I dove behind an overturned console, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sounds of battle filled the station, the crackle of plasma fire, the shriek of the Ravager's hunting cry, the screams of the dying. 3 minutes later, it was over. I peeked over the edge of the console and felt my stomach drop. 4 of the recruits were dead, their bodies torn and broken on the floor. 2 more were wounded, bleeding out in pools of alien blood that glowed faintly in the dim light. The Ravager stood in the center of the carnage, its many eyes scanning the room for survivors. Sergeant Vex was pinned beneath a piece of debris, one of his arms bent at an unnatural angle. His plasma rifle lay just out of reach. "Run," he gasped, his eyes finding mine. "Get back to the shuttle, get out of here." The Ravager's head turned toward him, and I saw its muscles bunch as it prepared to strike. I don't know what came over me in that moment. Maybe it was the adrenaline. Maybe it was the sheer, bone-deep refusal to let another person die in front of me. Maybe it was just the stupid human impulse to do something reckless when faced with impossible odds. I stood up. "Hey," I shouted, my voice echoing through the station. "Over here." The Ravager's head swiveled toward me, all those eyes focusing on my trembling form. I was barely 5'6", maybe 130 pounds soaking wet. The thing could have killed me with a casual swipe of its claw. And yet I found myself stepping forward. I remembered what my grandmother had told me back when I was a child growing up on Earth. She'd been a veterinarian, and she'd taught me how to read animals, how to understand their body language, how to know when to stand your ground and when to back away. The Ravager was a predator, yes, but it was also a creature, and every creature, no matter how terrifying, had its tells. I looked into its eyes, all of them, and I searched for what lay behind the hunger. Fear. Not the kind of fear that came from being threatened, the kind of fear that came from being hurt, from being in pain. And then I saw it. The way one of its hind legs was held slightly off the ground, not putting its full weight on it. The way its breathing was too fast, too shallow. It was injured. "The others are dead," I said slowly, keeping my voice calm and even. "You killed them, but I'm still here, and I can see that you're hurt." The Ravager made a sound that might have been a growl or might have been a whimper. It was hard to tell through all those teeth. "I don't want to hurt you," I said, "but I can't let you hurt anyone else. Do you understand?" Somewhere behind me, I heard Sergeant Vex's rasping voice. "Recruit, what the hell are you doing?" I ignored him. My eyes were locked on the Ravager's many eyes, watching for the shift in posture that would tell me it was about to attack. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The Ravager lowered its head. Not in submission. I'd seen enough animals back on Earth to know the difference. This was something else, something that looked almost like recognition. I took a tentative step forward and the creature didn't flinch. Another step, and I could see the injury more clearly now. A deep gash in its hind leg, still oozing that dark, iridescent blood. "Easy," I murmured, holding out my hand. "Easy, I want to help you." The Ravager's many eyes watched me approach, but it didn't attack. It didn't even growl. It just stood there, waiting. Behind me, I heard the survivors stirring. Low whispers of disbelief, the sound of weapons being raised. "No one shoots," I said, not looking away from the creature. "If any of you fires a single shot, you'll regret it." The Ravager's head tilted slightly, as if it was trying to understand me. And maybe it was. Maybe all that intelligence I'd sensed in its eyes was real. I reached out and touched its carapace. Later, I would learn that the Ravager was the last of its kind. An ancient creature that had been hunted nearly to extinction by the Coalition's military forces, driven from its territories, and forced to eke out an existence in the shadows of a world that had once been its home. The research station had been built on the site of its nesting grounds. The scientists hadn't known, or maybe they had, and they just assumed that the creature would be a minor inconvenience, easily dealt with by their superior technology. They'd been wrong. The Coalition had been wrong about a lot of things when it came to Xylos 7. But the biggest mistake they'd made, the one that would haunt them for decades to come, was underestimating the bond that could form between a human and a creature that everyone else saw as nothing but a monster. I spent the next 3 hours tending to the Ravager's wound, while the rest of the squad watched in stunned silence. I used my medkit, tearing strips from my uniform to create bandages, murmuring reassurances in a language the creature couldn't possibly understand. When I was done, the Ravager lifted its head and made a sound that was almost like a purr. It was then that the other survivors emerged from their hiding places. "You're insane," Sergeant Vex said, his voice hoarse. "Do you know that? You're completely insane." "Probably," I agreed, "but we're still alive." He stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head in disbelief. "That thing killed 4 of my soldiers, 4 of the best recruits I've ever trained, and you just walked up to it and made it your pet." "She's not a pet," I said, the word coming out more sharply than I'd intended. "She's a survivor just like us." The Ravager, I'd started thinking of her as a she in my head, nuzzled against my hand, her many eyes blinking in sequence. The humans who'd encountered these creatures before had always described them as mindless killers, but looking into those eyes, I saw something else entirely. I saw an old soul. A creature that had been around long enough to know that not all threats needed to be met with violence. And maybe, just maybe, I saw a creature that was willing to take a chance on a strange, fragile human who had done something no one else had ever thought to do. The rescue shuttle arrived 3 hours later, and the Coalition medical team that treated the survivors was baffled by what they found. 4 dead, 3 wounded, 1 human sitting cross-legged on the floor of the research station, the most terrifying predator in the known galaxy curled up beside her like a very large, very lethal house cat. "Human," the lead medic said, her crest of feathers rising in alarm. "That creature is classified as an Omega-level threat. We need to neutralize it immediately." I looked up at her, my face blank, and said nothing. The Ravager lifted its head and growled. The medic backed away, her hands raised. I'm just following protocol. Your protocol, I said, my voice quiet and steady, is outdated. This creature isn't a threat. She's been protecting us. The medic's eyes went wide. Protecting you from what? I didn't have to answer. At that moment, a distant shriek echoed through the jungle, and the Ravager rose to her feet, her body tensed and ready. From the things that live in the jungle, I said. The things that even the Coalition doesn't know about. She kept them away while we waited for rescue. The medic opened her mouth to argue, but Sergeant Vex cut her off. She's telling the truth. I saw it with my own eyes. The Ravager guarded the perimeter while we patched up our wounded. It took out at least 3 of those. He paused, searching for the right word. Whatever the hell they were. Big things. Had more legs than a Cathari merchant on promotion day. The medic looked between the sergeant and me, clearly trying to reconcile the impossible story she was hearing with the reality of the situation. I leaned against the Ravager's warm carapace and closed my eyes. Get the others on the shuttle, I said. I'll stay here until the last evac runs. And to my surprise, no one argued with me. The humans had made history. The evacuation from Xylos 7 became the stuff of legend. 4 shuttles came and went, each one carrying survivors and wounded back to the waiting fleet in orbit. And through it all, I stayed behind with the Ravager, watching the jungle for threats that never came. By the time the 5th shuttle arrived, this one commanded by a Coalition fleet admiral who'd come to see the miracle survivor for himself, the story had already spread through the fleet like wildfire. The human recruit who had tamed a Ravager. The fragile, backward ape from a barely space-worthy planet, who had done what no Coalition soldier had ever managed to do. When I finally stepped onto the shuttle, the Ravager at my heels, every single soldier on board saluted me. I'd never been saluted before in my life. At ease, I said, my voice heavy with exhaustion. I'm just a human who made a friend. The Admiral, a V-Corps with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that glowed with an inner light, stepped forward and extended his hand. On behalf of the Coalition, he said, I want to apologize. I blinked at him. For what? For underestimating your species, for treating humans as second-class citizens in the galactic community, for assuming that your lack of advanced technology meant you lacked value. He gripped my hand firmly, his claws careful not to break my skin. I was there, recruit. I was one of the officers who voted to approve Earth's recruitment into the Coalition's military forces. I thought it was a waste of resources. His glowing eyes met mine. I was wrong. I didn't know what to say to that. So I just nodded and let him pump my hand for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. The Ravager, meanwhile, had settled down on the shuttle's cargo deck, her many eyes scanning the other soldiers with wary suspicion. A few of them had their weapons half raised, but no one dared fire, not with me standing there. Someone needs to tell me, I said to the Admiral, what we're going to do about my friend here. The Admiral looked at the Ravager, his expression unreadable. In all my centuries of service, I have never encountered a situation like this. A human and a Ravager working together. It's unprecedented. Unprecedented doesn't mean impossible, I said. It just means no one's been stupid enough to try it before. The Admiral laughed, a sound like grinding stones, and clapped me on the shoulder. You're right, and from now on the Coalition is going to be a lot more careful about writing off the humans as useless. The Ravager made a sound that might have been agreement, and I couldn't help but smile. Part 2. The Rise of the Unlikely Hero. The days that followed were a blur of debriefings, medical examinations, and the endless, mind-numbing paperwork that seemed to be the Coalition's only real export. They had to assess me for psychological trauma and potential contaminant exposure, and the possible effects of long-term association with a Class Omega predator. I sat through it all, answering the same questions over and over again, until I started to suspect that the coalition was less interested in my well-being and more interested in figuring out how I'd done what I'd done. But even after all the interviews and examinations, and that nagging sense that I was being studied like a lab rat, the one thing they couldn't seem to figure out was what to do with the Ravager. She wouldn't leave my side. I'd tried everything, talking to her, pushing her away, even yelling at her to go back to the jungle. But she just followed me from place to place, her claws clicking on the metal floors of the fleet ships, her eyes watching the other soldiers with that same wary suspicion. "They're saying she's imprinted on you," Sergeant Vex told me one evening after I'd finished my third round of psychological evaluations. "It's something that happens with pack animals sometimes. The first creature they see after a traumatic event becomes their anchor." I looked at the Ravager, who was currently curled up in a corner of the medical bay, looking about as threatening as a very large dog. "I'm not her pack," I said. "I'm just the person who didn't shoot her." Vex snorted. "That's more than anyone else has ever done for her kind. For centuries, the Coalition has hunted Ravagers to extinction. They thought the species was gone for good, and then you came along and, made friends." "Something like that," I said. The truth was, I didn't fully understand what had happened on Xylos 7. I'd followed my instincts, the same instincts that had kept me alive through a rough childhood and a string of bad decisions back on Earth. And my instincts had told me that the Ravager wasn't a mindless killer. She was just scared. Scared and hurting, and desperate for someone to see past the teeth and claws. I suppose I recognized that feeling. I'd felt the same way plenty of times in my life. The Coalition fleet had gathered in orbit around Xylos 7, waiting for the all-clear from the scientists and military strategists who were trying to figure out what had gone wrong with the research station. But the truth was, no one really knew. The distress signal had been automated, triggered by a failure in the station's life support systems. But the station's main power core had been sabotaged, and the emergency backup systems had been disabled by something, or someone, with an intimate knowledge of Coalition technology. The Rebels. That's what the Coalition called them. A loose alliance of species and factions who had been fighting against the Coalition's central authority for decades. They'd been behind the sabotage. They'd wanted to make a statement by destroying the station and blaming it on the Ravager, hoping to reignite the ancient hatred for the species. What they hadn't counted on was me. "What I don't understand," I said to Vex, "is why they didn't just bomb the station from orbit. Why go through all the trouble of sabotaging the life support and the power core?" Vex's expression darkened. "Because they wanted it to look like the Ravager had done it. If it had been a simple bombing, the Coalition would have traced it back to them within hours. But a Ravager attack, that would have started a war that the Coalition would have lost." I stared at him. "The Coalition lost a war to the Rebels." Vex shook his head. "Not to them. To the other species, the ones who have been waiting for a reason to rise up against us. The Ravagers were symbols of something. I don't fully understand it. But if the Rebels had succeeded in making it look like the Ravager had killed the scientists, it would have been a bloodbath, planets burning, civilizations falling. And now the Ravager is your pet, and the Rebels are scrambling to figure out what went wrong." Vex grinned, showing teeth. "You've done more damage to them with one act of compassion than the entire Coalition military has managed in 5 years." I shook my head slowly, trying to process everything he was telling me. I just wanted to help. I'd seen an injured animal, and I'd followed the instincts that had been bred into humanity since the dawn of time. I hadn't meant to become a symbol. "I didn't want to be a hero," I said. "I just wanted to stay alive." "Welcome to the Coalition," Vex said, clapping me on the shoulder. Where even the best intentions get you caught up in galactic politics. The Ravager, I'd started calling her Nyx, after the old Earth goddess of the night, lifted her head and made a sound that might have been a question. "I'm fine," I told her, "just trying to figure out how to live with the decisions I've made." She blinked her many eyes at me and then settled back down to watch the medical bay's door, guarding, protecting. Just like she had on Xylos 7. I was in the fleet's main mess hall when the rebels attacked. It happened without warning. One moment I was eating something that was trying very hard to taste like chicken, and the next the entire ship lurched violently, sending tables and chairs sliding across the floor. Alarms blared, emergency lights flashed, and in the chaos I heard the unmistakable sound of weapons fire from somewhere above. The rebels had breached the ship's hull. "Everyone to the evacuation pods," someone was shouting. "This is not a drill." I scrambled to my feet, Nyx's claws clicking beside me as I made for the door. But before I could reach it, the bulkhead exploded inward, sending shrapnel flying in all directions. I hit the deck hard, shielding my face from the debris. When I looked up, a soldier in black armor was standing in the hole, his weapon trained on the survivors in the mess hall. "Don't move," he said, his voice distorted by a synthesizer. "We're not here for you, we're here for the human, the one who tamed the Ravager." My blood went cold. They were looking for me. Nyx launched herself at the soldier before I could say or do anything to stop her. It was over in seconds. The soldier didn't even have time to scream. One moment he was standing there, weapon raised. The next, Nyx had him pinned to the floor, her claws at his throat. "Don't kill him," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to know why they came." Nyx made a sound of frustration but backed off, standing protectively between me and the fallen soldier. "Your pet is very loyal," the soldier gasped, his helmet's synthesizer crackling from the damage Nyx had done. "But it won't be enough. The rebels have been watching you since Xylos 7. We know what you did. We know what you are." "What I am," I said. "I'm just a human who didn't want to shoot a wounded animal." "Exactly," he said. "A human, the Coalition's greatest weakness. A species that doesn't belong in space, that shouldn't exist in the galactic community. And yet you found a way to win, to defeat us without firing a single shot." He laughed, a wet, rattling sound. "That terrifies them, you know. The Coalition doesn't know what to do with you. You've upset the balance of power. You've made them look foolish." "Shut up," I snapped. "You're not here to give me a history lesson. You're here to capture me." "To use you," he corrected. "The rebels want to study you, to understand how you did it, to create more humans who can command Ravagers." The thought was so horrifying that it took me a moment to process it. "You want to weaponize humans, make us into soldiers." "Make you into weapons," he said, "better than the Coalition ever could." Behind me, I heard the sound of more soldiers arriving. The Coalition's security team, finally responding to the breach. "Don't move," I said to the rebel, my voice surprisingly steady. "Don't try anything stupid." But the rebel was already moving, his hand reaching for something on his belt. A grenade of some kind, I realized too late. Nyx saw it at the same moment I did. She lunged forward, her massive body crashing into the rebels, sending the grenade flying out of his hand and across the floor. It detonated in midair, the flash of light and heat bright enough to blind me for a moment. When I could see again, the rebel was gone. His body had been vaporized by the blast. Nyx stood over me, her carapace smoking from the heat, her many eyes blinking in rapid sequence. "You just saved my life," I whispered, reaching up to touch her face. "Again." She rumbled a sound that might have been pleasure and nuzzled against my hand. The Coalition security team arrived a moment later, and I found myself being hustled out of the mess hall and into a secure section of the ship. The Admiral was waiting for me, his face grim. "The rebels are more desperate than I thought," he said. "They're targeting you specifically, Recruit. They know what you represent." "And what's that?" I asked. "An opportunity, a weapon." "A symbol," he said. "The same thing the Ravager represents, the possibility of peace, the chance for coexistence." He looked at me, his ancient eyes full of something that might have been hope. "The rebels have spent decades building their cause on hatred and fear, and now you've come along and shown the galaxy that the most dangerous creatures in existence can be befriended, can be understood, can be saved." I didn't know what to say to that. The whole thing felt too big, too important for someone like me. I was just a human, a flawed, imperfect human who'd gotten lucky. "I'm not a symbol," I said. "I'm just a person." "Sometimes," the Admiral said, "that's exactly what the galaxy needs." The days that followed were a blur of official ceremonies and addresses from the coalition's leaders. And through it all, I thought about what the rebel had said. "We know what you did. We know what you are." What exactly had I done? I'd made a choice, yes, a choice that had felt like the only sensible option at the time. But looking back, I couldn't help wondering if I'd done the right thing. After all, I hadn't just saved a wounded animal. I'd changed the course of galactic history. And that was a responsibility I hadn't asked for, one I wasn't sure I wanted. Nyx seemed to sense my unease. She was always there, close by, her presence a comfort and a burden at the same time. "Is this what you expected?" I asked her one evening as we stood looking out at the stars. "When you were living in that jungle, did you ever think you'd end up on a spaceship?" She rumbled softly, her eyes fixed on the same stars. "Neither did I said. "Neither did I." But despite everything, the fear, the uncertainty, the weight of what I'd done, I wouldn't change any of it. Because in a galaxy full of aliens who looked down on humanity, I'd found a friend, a creature who loved me without judgment, without expectation. And that, I realized, was worth more than all the Coalition's medals and honors combined. The galaxy had called Nyx an apex predator, a monster, a beast that was beyond redemption. But in the end, it was the monster who taught me what it meant to be human. Part 3: A New Dawn. The Coalition's response to the rebel attack on the fleet was swift and brutal. Within days, they had identified the rebel base, a hidden outpost on a moon in the Betelgeuse system, and had dispatched a task force to deal with them. I was given a choice. I could stay behind with the other non-combatants, my role in the conflict officially over, or I could join the task force, bringing Nyx with me. I chose the latter. "It's not about wanting to be a hero," I told Sergeant Vex when he asked me why. "It's about seeing this through. I started this. I need to finish it." Vex had looked at me for a long moment, his 4 arms crossed over his chest. "You're either the bravest human I've ever met," he said, "or the most foolish." "Maybe a bit of both," I replied. Nyx was ready to go before I was. She'd been restless since the attack, pacing the cargo bay of the fleet ship like a caged animal. I think she understood, on some level, that the rebels were a threat that needed to be dealt with, and she was eager to do her part. We boarded the task force ship together, my hand resting on Nyx's carapace as we walked up the ramp. The other soldiers gave us a wide berth, their eyes full of wariness, and, I was surprised to see, respect. The human who had tamed a Ravager was no longer a curiosity or a novelty. I was something else entirely. Something the galaxy had never seen before. The ship's captain, a crustacean-like alien named Atrosh, met us on the bridge. "Your reputation precedes you, Recruit," he said, his claws clicking together in what I assumed was a greeting. "I've heard the stories. The human who walked into a den of monsters and walked out with the queen of them all." I flushed slightly at the description. Nyx isn't a monster, she's just misunderstood. Atrosh clicked his claws again, and I got the sense that he was laughing. "The galaxy's most dangerous creature, and you call her misunderstood. You're a remarkable species, humans, truly remarkable. The journey to the rebel base took 3 days. During that time, I spent most of my hours with Nyx, talking to her in the low, soothing voice that seemed to calm her. I told her about my life on Earth, about my family, about the childhood dreams I'd had that had never quite come true. And she listened, her many eyes fixed on me, her massive body curled up beside me in the cramped quarters of the ship. In return, she told me her story, or at least, the part of it that I could understand. The loneliness of being the last of her kind, the fear of being hunted, the desperate, burning need to find something to hold onto. It made her sound so human, I thought, surprised, so familiar. When the attack came, we were ready. The task force dropped out of hyperspace directly above the rebel base, and the battle was on. Laser fire crisscrossed the void of space as the coalition ships engaged the rebel defenses, and I watched it all on the bridge's holographic display, my heart pounding in my chest. And then we landed on the moon's surface, and it was time for the ground assault. I could feel the Wracker's presence before I saw it, a subtle shift in the air, a growing sense of unease that prickled at the back of my neck. I reached out with my mind, feeling for the connection that had formed between us on Xylos 7, and found it waiting. She was scared, confused. The chaos of the battle was overwhelming her ancient senses, and she was struggling to find her place in it. But she wasn't alone, not anymore. I reached out to her, the connection between us growing stronger with each passing second. "I'm here," I sent. "We'll get through this, together." In the distance, I saw Nyx's massive form emerge from the shadows of the rebel base's outer wall. She moved with the same powerful grace I'd seen on Xylos 7, her legs carrying her forward through the chaos. The rebels who got in her way were scattered like leaves in a storm, their weapons useless against her armored carapace. And then she was there, standing before me, her many eyes meeting mine. "Ready?" I asked her. She dipped her head in reply, and then we advanced. The rebel base was a maze of corridors and rooms, all of them filled with enemy soldiers who were determined to stop us. But with Nyx at my side, I was unstoppable. She carved through them like a knife through butter, her claws and teeth a blur of motion that left nothing but destruction in their wake. I fired my own weapon, adding my small contribution to the chaos. But in truth, I was a minor player. The real force was Nyx, the apex predator who had found a purpose beyond the jungle. We reached the heart of the base just as the coalition forces were closing in around us. The rebel leader, a hulking creature with a massive clawed arm, was waiting for us in the command center. "You," he spat as we entered, his eyes burning with hatred. "The human who ruined everything." I was tired, so tired after everything I'd been through. And standing there in that command center, staring down the leader of the rebels, I knew it was time to end this. "You wanted to control us," I said. "You wanted to make humans into weapons, into monsters. You were wrong about us." The rebel leader snarled and lunged toward me. But before he could reach me, Nyx was there, intercepting the attack with a blur of motion. The fight was brutal and short. Nyx was larger and more powerful than the rebel leader, and she had something he would never understand. A connection, a bond forged in trust and compassion. When it was done, the rebel leader lay broken on the floor, and Nyx stood over him, her many eyes fixed on me. "Contact the coalition forces," I said, my voice hoarse. "Tell them it's over." And with those words, the battle came to an end. The aftermath of the rebel attack was chaotic. The coalition's victory came at a heavy cost, with thousands of soldiers killed and wounded. But thanks to Nyx and me, the human who befriended the monster, as they called us, the battle was a success. The months that followed were spent rebuilding and recovering. I was given a promotion, but I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a person who'd done what she had to do, guided by an instinct she didn't fully understand. The coalition's leaders gave speeches, awarding me medals and honors. Nyx was officially recognized as an honorary member of the coalition, a diplomatic position that gave her a voice in the galaxy's affairs. But the truth was simpler than the stories would have people believe. In the end, I was just a human. A flawed, imperfect human who'd found a way to listen to the voice of the universe, to respect the bond between creatures, to trust in the power of compassion. And Nyx, the Ravager, the apex predator, the creature that others called a monster, was my friend. A friend who had taught me the true meaning of courage. A friend who had shown me that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. And so, the story of the human recruit who tamed a Ravager was told throughout the galaxy, inspiring countless others to look beyond appearances and find common ground with all living creatures. The Coalition's view of humans was transformed. We were no longer seen as a weak, fragile species, but as a people with a unique ability to connect, to empathize, to find bridges across the chasms of difference. And Nyx, the Ravager, the warrior, the friend, became a symbol of hope, a symbol of the power of understanding, a symbol that would echo through the ages, a reminder of what it means to be human. The galaxy had called Nyx an apex predator, a monster, a beast that was beyond redemption. But in the end, it was the monster who taught us all what it meant to be truly alive. And to this day, my thoughts turn to the stars, to the galaxy that welcomed me with open arms, to the creature who gave me a new purpose. I think of Nyx and I smile. Because in a universe of endless possibilities, anything is possible. Even a human and a Ravager fighting side by side against the darkness. Even a bond forged in trust and compassion, built on the shared experience of being the underdog. Even a hope that will never fade. Epilogue: What the Stars Remember. Decades passed. The Coalition grew and changed, shaped by the events that had unfolded on Xylos 7. Humans rose in the ranks, earning respect for their adaptability and their capacity for compassion. And Nyx, the legendary Ravager, the creature who had once been hunted to near extinction, found a new home among the stars. She lived out her days as an ambassador, traveling from world to world, spreading the message of peace that I had started all those years ago. She was a living symbol of the power of connection, a reminder that even the most feared beings are capable of change. When Nyx finally passed, the galaxy mourned. Her funeral was the largest and most elaborate the Coalition had ever witnessed, a testament to the impact she had made on the universe. And as I stood at her grave, looking out at the stars, I felt a profound sense of peace. Nyx had changed me. She had shown me the true meaning of bravery and friendship. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The stars remembered. The stars would always remember. And so, the story came full circle. A human from the dirt of Earth, following an instinct that had been honed by millennia of evolution, carving a path through the galaxy on the back of the impossible. A path paved by loyalty, by empathy, by the unshakable certainty that trust is never wasted. They laughed at the human recruit. But when Nyx lowered her head and took my orders, the laughter stopped. And the whole galaxy stood up and took notice.